Oh, hi Aditya, nice to see you.
Hi, nice to meet you.
Cool. So, we have amazing content lined up, so I won't take much of the time. So, hi everyone, I'm really excited for this session today. I'm gonna discuss generative algorithmic thinking with Karthik Dondeti. He's an architect, computational designer, generative artist. His co-founder of Art Studio Codeball and founder of architecture studio Voxelscapes. I got to know about Karthik from few of the computational designer friends I have in India, and they were like, Mayur, you should definitely check out Karthik's work. He's doing amazing uh, work with algorithms. And then I got connected, and he has been very supportive to the community. He also organizes CC Sante meetups for creative coders in India. So uh, glad to see his work and excited for this session.
Thanks, Mayur. Sorry, I'm waiting for the talk.
Yeah. So
Cool.
the
Thanks
go
for having me. It's fun. Yeah, sorry, you're saying something.
Yeah, I was just gonna say that the goal of the session is we review few of the artworks done by Karthik and know the process. If you have any Q&A, feel free to share it on the chat, and we'll try to make it as interactive as we can. Go ahead, Karthik. The stage is yours.
Yeah, thanks. I am going to share. Um, yeah, so we've been discussing this, Mayur and I, and literally I'm going to pull up our Insta handle and go through some work. And I mean, it's hopefully, well, not hopefully, the goal is not to show the work that's been there and you can see it, but the process, or at least most of them, I think, usually I pick up on, I get bored really fast. So usually I pick up on something, build a couple of pieces, move on to the next one. Um, and the process, the only process that's common to all this is they're almost, no, they're all of them are code driven. There's a mix of real time work and non real time work. So I can point out that when we hit a bunch of very different toolkits that I've used over the years. Yeah, it's like a massive experiment of sorts. And I'm just going to share the screen and Mayu, we can, yeah, you can
Yeah, sure.
start.
Oh, do you want me to? Okay. Yeah. Awesome.
No, all right. You can see, right?
Yeah, it's awesome. Clearly visible.
Right, I start
So,
at the bottom. No, no, CC Santa, I tell people don't come prepared with any presentation, open your whatever, and but it is kind of awkward. Okay, so where were we? We were talking about,
I think this comparison was uh,
sorry, what?
you had one image about comparing this one. Let me annotate.
Comparing what?
Uh, the workflow chart you had this. Uh, 1 second. I think it's at the bottom.
Oh, okay.
Uh, few images up. I'll annotate. I think this one.
Ah, okay. Yeah, hold on. So, this one's called, the toolkit is called BBBB. Pronounced slightly differently. It's a German uh, team that's developed it. It's fairly old, I think. So, a little bit of background. I finished architecture in 2008, and at that point in time, I was trying to, I was following the works of other computational designers. And still, I wouldn't say it was in nascent stages, but definitely early for us in India at least. So, especially schools like AA in London and Columbia and other schools, IARC and few more. And we didn't have the kind of tools we have today. Like today, you have a whole host of tools, architecture I'm talking about, and they're very few. So this particular one is it's an interactive real-time toolkit. It's a general purpose programming in some ways. It's meant for live installations of all sorts, and this was my foray into programming. So I don't have any programming background, and I never did programming in school. And architecture school, obviously, we were never exposed to any of these. I mean, even today, it's not all that common, although it's getting better. So VVVV was one of the toolkits that somebody had recommended to me, and I jumped in, and it has this. For the first time I'd seen a node-based interface, which was kind of new for me, but also because I didn't know how to program. This helped me, and coming from architecture background, it's more visual in that sense. So kind of, so you to have maybe I'll try and, no, I don't have it installed here, sorry. So only problem with this is Windows only, this particular toolkit. It doesn't work on Mac or Linux. So it's similar to our Grasshopper or any of the other toolkits you have, Max, MSP, PDP, cables, so many tools you have today. But essentially you double click, you have all these little nodes, they do lots of different things, and then you plug and play and then connect it and do stuff. So this particular one is just trying to pixelate, and you have taken images of data, and I was trying to create this almost impressionist kind of workflow. So it kind of samples the pixels randomly, and then overlays that with a circle with the color picks sampled from that particular location, and there's a bit of translucency. So as it keeps getting layered, you start seeing this. And you can probably see the process a bit there. So it's kind of layering itself. In every frame, it kind of randomly picks an X number of pixels, starts putting up these little circles on top, keep overlaying it because of the translucency, and eventually you start getting this slightly impressionist kind of.
I see. So like for an image, it divides into pixel grid, and then it randomly chooses which pixel to display, and one can play with the value of translucency. And because of that random spots, it creates a character of animation. And
yeah, essentially that. In fact, most of the work here, it's a standard process. Like if I just go down a bit, I don't know, let's just take a portrait. So now this one is also sampled from an image. It's the same process, but in processing, not in VV before. What I'm doing there is also the same thing. You start with some random location on the image. You sample the pixel value for its RGB values, and then you convert into black and white. That's straightforward. And all I'm doing here is I'll try and play this. It'll get you more sense. But what's happening here is not random location. So it picks one location. The next location it picks is based on the Berlin noise. So that's how you get this really smooth kind of motion. And most of this actually I'll try and run the code because it makes more sense and it looks better that way. The final products are not so. Let me see. Yeah, I don't think it's the. No, sorry.
yeah, and just to clarify, like there are a lot of random and like a lot of noise functions one could play with. So the Berlin noise is better in terms of continuous values in the domain.
Yeah, so Berlin noise, again, there's a lot of material out there. So you can start seeing the formation, right? I'll not run this forever, but you can essentially that, except that it's sampling with color and black and white doesn't matter, it's all the same. So Berlin noise works really well because when you do random sampling, there's no control, right? It's just randomly picking from wherever. Like this one is totally random. It's got a certain effect, but what Berlin noise does is it kind of controls your randomness. So it's one of the most heavily used, I would say, algorithm in most generative art pieces because you have this very smooth motion. It is random, but it is not random in that sense. It just doesn't directly jump from here to there. It's got this kind of smooth motion of sorts. That little thing, and that particular algorithm you can use for. This is a very basic example of just sampling points and colors, but you can use it to make all sorts of things in 2D, 3D, and even shaders and all sorts of things. probably I think every single piece of work that I've done in terms of code has Perlin noise most often. It's there somewhere or the other. Sometimes very obvious, sometimes it's not. But it's one of those heavily used algorithms. Yeah. All of this, like this has Perlin noise, these have Perlin noise.
Yeah,
Even
and
rate shattered, for example. Sorry, yeah.
no, go ahead.
No, I'm just trying to point out more. That's all. Like this one, it's entirely. I think I have an animation somewhere. I'll try and show that. Never mind. I'll pull it up later. But I don't know. I can play. Sorry. You're asking something, Mayur.
Yeah, so I think one thing I want to like clarify on Perlin noise is many times when we are playing with creative algorithms, it's the relationship between neighboring pixels which can be explored and exploited in different ways. So Perlin maps, because of its continuous wave function, when the neighboring pixels are, let's say one is playing with the height map or different data, there is some relationship which makes it continuous and gradual. But if the same neighboring pixels have random values, it can be very drastic change, and sometimes it doesn't give that organic output.
So polynoise itself has a set of parameters that you can control, and that kind of controls the jumps that you're talking about. And so if it's extremely smooth, then it will be like almost predictable in a way. Or got a very smooth animation, and you kind of see it. And if you so the way I tweak it is purely based on visual effect. Like when you start, I mean, like that's most of creative coding, right? It's always feedback loop. So you write something, you dump it, but then you start tweaking it and you understand that okay, it's balance that I need for a certain effect. So same with the terrain, for example, like what you said, the height maps can jump really drastically. So when it gets really big jumps, then it's very hard to differentiate between that and a random sampling. So it kind of becomes not so useful in that sense. You might have to do it randomly, save some computation power, right? So sampling randomly is much faster and easier. So you can see this same Bezier curve. So what's happening here is drawing this Bezier curve. So in this case, what's happening is literally it's got about 4 concentric circles of sort hidden. So it takes a point from the first circle, a point from the third one, second, third, and fourth, and it draws a Bezier curve. Bezier by nature is going to be the smooth thing, but because it's Perlin noise, on each curve, when it picks this is the first point, the second point might be here or here, but not too far from that point there. And then the second point here might, whatever. So it does look predictable, but suddenly it will change direction. And again, like I said, depending on how much the parameters vary, either it becomes very predictable and just continuing that, or it starts folding onto itself and so on. And that creates these like this, right? It's much more chaotic than the other ones, but essentially that.
I see. So like the 4 parameters of the curve, the start point and the intermediate points, along with the color, has a random nature, and the start point has been taken from Perlin noise, where it has some like organic movement around the start point, so it's not too far, but I see.
Yeah,
And
because if you
it's
do it randomly, you can imagine that if I sample 4 different points randomly and then to do it, it'll just be total chaos, right? You're going to have this basic curve that cut across each other. But then the moment you notice these kind of formations, you know that there's some level of control, although it is randomized. And that's directly an indication of Perlin noise. So what happens is the inner circle and that's the outer circle. There are 2 more. And on each circle, every frame it picks a point which is closer to where it picked the last one, not too far apart. And if I draw a straight line, obviously it will be the sharp angles. The basic curves is going to be like nice. And now the color itself is typically what I end up doing is you can write a color scale. So again, you can sample colors based on a Perlin noise or something else, or it can be random also. As long as it's a uniform color scale, you can get interesting patterns. But But one trick that I've developed not developed, but that worked well for me over the years is I directly sample from images. So if I know a certain image
Oh.
and I like this beautiful palette, right? I mean, it could be from a movie or it could be good graphic design or a poster that you've seen and you're fascinated by generally like the harmony or the color palette. So then so all of these, for example, um, curves again attract a point. We'll talk about it, but the color sampling is all from images. So while it's plotting these points, I have a hidden image at the background where it's trying to take the color from the image below. Again, there has to be a balance because if there's a lot of what you call a graphic on top, and if it's literally replicating the image below, then you'll start seeing the image. Then there's some bit of randomness introduced or some slightly different way of sampling what color. But then I don't worry about, I don't do the hard work of trying to create a color palette. I'm basing it off something else. I think that's what is happening here also. I haven't set a palette here.
I see. I think that's interesting process. And just to get it right, so in the first layer, it's drawing all the Bezier curves, and in the second layer, it's asking for that pixel, look at the image and take that color value.
Yeah.
Okay.
So the Bezier curve itself, so the entire curve is being drawn at once, which means the entire curve is going to be the same color. Sure, you can draw parts of it differently, but that was not in this case. I didn't want to do that. So when it first samples the color, and then it plots the 4 points, and then draws it with that. I mean, okay, that steps can be interchanged. It's not really doesn't make a difference. The one downside of doing this is trying to sample colors from an image is very computationally heavy. So for real-time works, for things like this is okay. But if I want to do a real-time work and a large-scale work, if I have a very high-resolution image and if I'm trying to be very accurate about picking a color and doing it in every frame, then it's unnecessarily adding a lot of lag to your project. Yeah, or you have to end up putting a very powerful computer to do something very simple. So it's not very efficient in that sense. I mean, there are algorithms that can speed it up and all, but obviously, if you define a color palette, there's nothing like it. That will be the fastest because it's just mathematical. You're not doing the extra step of passing an image and picking out the color sample there. Depends on the work. So when we do a print or let's say if I'm making a poster or illustration or whatever else, then it doesn't matter at all. I don't care about the computation. It can be slow, but it's going to do its job. For any real-time work or things that you want to be or animations and all, animations are also okay because if it's not real-time, then I'm just exporting the frames and eventually stitching them, so it doesn't matter. But any real-time work and then all of this, every little optimization becomes super critical. Right? I mean, I'm sure in your workflow you've seen that all the time. Right? Tiny optimization are used. So then we don't try and avoid these kind of hacks as much as possible.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point. And like I have just to clarify, so there is like sequential coding method where step by step code operates and that happens on CPU. But nowadays a lot of coders, creative coders are exploring GPU based method where all the pixels are calculated at once. And I know you have projects on like web code GL and WebGL which works on that parallel GPU functionality.
Yeah. Now the other thing, if you remember, is most people in the creative coding, I shouldn't be generalizing this, but at least my experience, people I see in the community, a lot of them are coming from a background of either artist or I'm basically non-programming background. And creative coding in that sense has been kind of bridging that gap, right? Making non-programmers to kind of at least delve into this realm. So then we are the kind of people who are not going to get to that level of detail of trying to understand how to optimize things or CPU or GPU, multi-core processing and all that. Then the tools, we depend on the tools a lot. So if I use processing of P5JS as based on JavaScript, and if it's built in a certain way, then I'm trying to leverage whatever it offers. And then there are, of course, a section of people who are like super good, hardcore, low-level programmers who are like, can crunch out. So when you then step into real time, then that becomes the bottleneck. Until then, where most creative coding happens, you don't have to worry too much about even writing good code for that matter, as long as. And I tell this to my architecture students also. You guys, like, no one's judging you. You're not making a software for somebody to use later. So don't over optimize things. Try and think visually, think graphically, think computationally as to what you're doing, why you're doing, and solve it. Don't care about performance at all.
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense because like in earlier stage, even like I was doing like trial and error, playing with algorithms and trying out different libraries, and that exploration stage itself makes the creative part more exciting. Like it's very comes to very engineering when one is doing optimization and saving time frame, but like for non-programmers or getting started, it's more about exploration.
Yep.
Okay.
Sorry. So, when next?
Yeah, I think you had quite interesting project about Tokyo in.
One. I mean, it's all of this is same series. All these. So literally this and this whole body of work that I've built where I borrow concepts from other fields. This one is an attractor point, attractor series. It's a mathematical. Let me the wiki for this. Current system is. So yeah, you can see it on right.
Yeah,
Yeah, this one is more commonly seen. So I literally borrow a lot of work from other fields. So I come across things that I look exciting to me, and then where was yeah. So this one is absolutely that. All I what I've done is I've gone ahead and studied the math for this. As in studied in the sense you don't need to really know the underlying math, but as long as you're you know how to leverage there are these math equations set up for you. All the work is done. So then I pick them up. So I see this and I say, how do I now use it for my work? And I'm interested in chaos systems, interested in this this whole system where it's extremely mathematical, super what do you call? Forgetting word for it. Anyway, but it's got this randomness, but not random. Right? It's a common thread in most of the work that I'm talking about. And so this was in processing. I'll try and play the code. What I'm doing here is taking that math, plotting points based on it, but sampling again the same thing, sampling colors and playing with the thickness of the points, as in this case circles that are drawn, and the translucency, and see what comes out of it. And to me, a lot of this work is both. That's very therapeutic in that sense. It's not so much about the final figure. You know? Like I've only because Instagram and all is good for showing this, but really the process is much slower. And when you compute this and you start seeing it form in the background, it's really beautiful to just watch them emerge because it looks like some random points. For the first few minutes, it doesn't make sense. It just look, and then suddenly you start seeing patterns. And humans, we're always kind of intuitively try and find patterns everywhere. So you start seeing small things, and then you make up your own patterns, and eventually it starts forming more and more. And the entire process is quite beautiful with the way it plays out. Let me see if I can find it. Yeah, this one. Now there's no guarantee that it will work because what happens is in these attractors, okay, it is forming. Hopefully, it will make sense in a minute. It's very subtle right now because the beginning it's got millions of points. So in the first two frames, it's so thin and so small that you don't really see the patterns. And also, this is a little sped up. And again, you're watching in a browser, but if you play it on a desktop and had on a larger screen and you plot them bigger, then it starts making more. Well, okay, so yeah, so the attractor points, the attractor series, what happens is you take any of the attractors and the multiple that have been discovered by mathematicians over the years. And at any point, let's say I said to take a Lorentz series here, and then we've got certain parameters. We change the parametric values, and it within the same system of the attractor, this thing, it changes. So it looks unique in that sense. So, for example, this particular one is just parametric change, and it's got the radial character, and it's got this central focal point, and whatever is happening. I changed, there's about 4 or 5 parameters in the equation. We change one of them. I'll show you the code also. It changes drastically, and that's kind of nice, very beautiful, because it's kind of unpredictable. Each time it runs, there's something new that happens. Yeah, and that's kind of quite neat. Also, the downside is that it's guaranteed that half the time nothing shows up because math is computing and points are plotted way beyond your canvas. It's hard to guess what the boundaries are also. I mean, it's not even optimized, like I said. So if you make this for real-time work, then I would have had to write it differently. So are you able to see, I don't know, with the whole screen sharing, is it even, are you able to make out?
Yeah, it's clear.
Right, I think the colors here are subtle, so you're not, and a lot of it, okay, yeah, that's one more thing. A lot of this depends on how you color it. So one thing is to plot the points, but choices of how you want to color code this makes a huge impact on how you see the thing. And that also changes the perception. So code, because this was in Java, P5JS. So it's not too big if you notice, right? Because all of this, so P5, I don't know if anyone's used it here, but essentially it's a port of processing but on JavaScript, and it has these two main functions, setup and draw. Setup is basically to set up whatever initial conditions for your program, and this runs only once. And really, what really majorly happens is this draw loop, where whatever you write inside the draw function is looping continuously. Whatever frame rate your code runs at. By default, it is at 60 frames per second. Now, in the what I've done is I'm not computing the points in this code because it's kind of unnecessary. So I've taken the math, I've already computed the points and plotted it. I saved a CSV file somewhere. So I've done that, and that you can do any which either in Python or whatever you work with, because it's just a mathematical equation. Right? You just have to plot the points. So I've already done that. I'm only loading the points, so that's how it's a little faster. And then it's just drawing the. So here is a loop. Actually, you can ignore the loop. All it's doing is it's taking the point x and the point y from, I mean, the x and y coordinates from my master file, and it's kind of remapping it to the canvas size because I need to plot it on the canvas. And then, okay, I've done the curve vertex here, but essentially ellipse here, that's the circle. This I think I've done it later. I try to make a continuous curve lines, but if I do this, it's just plotting the points and the circle. And somewhere here up front, I would have given it the color. I'll find it anyway.
Yeah, I see the logic. Yeah.
Yeah, sorry, no. This is I'm not running this. Anyway, yeah. Sorry.
Yeah. So the overall.
Yeah. Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah. So the overall goal, like the process is, you took an attractor algorithm, you converted that curves into points. Now and then you saved in a CSV file. You're calling the CSV file and reading all the points, and while constructing those curves, you are gradually changing the opacity of each point reading, and then it's constructed as an ellipse.
Yeah. So some of this, the colors, like this particular one, can kind of see a city scale in the background. I'll show you the actual image I've sampled from, and that should make things very clear. It's kind of. Yeah, this one. Now you see that, and I think I've done it in a couple of places. Even this, I move it side. can start seeing some semblance, right? Like it's this little orange streak that's happening there. So it's not a one-to-one mapping, because then it almost looks like a photograph, and then you start losing meaning of this geometry at the back. If I plot it exactly as pixel to pixel, then it will look like I'm taking an existing image and only kind of masking out the rest. It's kind of, so there's some bit of a hack there in terms of how I sample the, so it does retain some structure. So that's how there's a little bit of continuity and a bit of harmony, I would argue, but it's also not absolute replica. So I'd sample it and then do something with it and plot it to a different part of the image. So it's not plotting the same part. So you start seeing a bit of the skyline here, but then this roadway is kind of morphing like that. That's all purely artistic sensibilities. No hard and fast.
So is the like pixel reference like displaced where it's
correct? So I reference
okay.
it, then I displace it, and the way you displace it, again, if you displace it equally, it'll just be that the picture has shifted. So then I displace it with another little bit of math, so that it's you can do Perlin noise, but it's overkill. Sometimes I just do very straightforward thing that don't go pixel to pixel, like to like, maybe go radially, or maybe go some diagonally, whatever, just play around to see what works. It also depends a lot on your form here, right? So if something like this is like a donut, it becomes super obvious if you're not careful with how you color it. So then you can start seeing the entire thing, no matter how you distort it, it'll still read the same. So then you have to do some bit of stuff like that. And randomly, it kind of loses its. So it's kind of a balance. Yeah. Sorry.
No problem. I just wanted to take one step back. So the way you work around this artwork is like based on your study and exploration, you find some inspiration from other fields, then you think about that algorithm and how that can be translated into different artwork with while playing with the parameters of that algorithm and trying out different style. So like what's your piece of advice to people who wants to like try out different algorithms and like.
So very often what happens is, I don't really sit down to say, okay, I'm going to make something artistic, whatever artistic means. I don't start with an agenda saying I want to make something around it. Unless it's a professional work, then you have a concept, and that's a whole different thing. None of this is professional. The ones I'm showing you so far. So all these explorative works are more organic. So you come across some concept, and then you start thinking. I'm almost always looking at not so much about an algorithm per se. Sometimes it is. Sometimes it's just a process that you see somewhere. At some point, I discovered that the whole L systems, Lindenmayer systems, are kind of. If you're not familiar, Lindenmayer is a botanist who devised certain logic to kind of map plant growth, which looks very abstract, but into some sort of a logical system, right? The first time I came across it, blew my mind. Like, that's interesting, because something that is super organic is now mathematical. Sure, I mean, it's not again a one-to-one thing. No one's arguing that it can be completely mathematical, but then someone's seen a pattern and kind of codified it. And then for me, the way I operate is, and I start thinking, okay, what can I do with this? Can I borrow this concept and can I make text out of it, or can I make a graphic out of it, or can I don't know, maybe make an architectural form? And there are people who've done housing design based on L systems. Now, because it's an exploration, you're not really concerned about at this point whether there's any practical use of it or whether there is any functional requirement. No, it's just purely abstract. You're just trying to borrow a concept that you've seen somewhere and that triggered, and trying to see something, plug it back into something else. Like the Markov chains, which is again it'll take too much time to start getting into it, but it's some little piece that I've come across a long time back. And then he said, okay, how do you make? I've seen someone work with text on Markov chains. So then you're constructing text which is completely nonsensical in meaning, but grammatically nearly correct. And that was very interesting. I said, what can I do with this? So at some point, I put up an installation in Delhi where I'd taken about 4 or 5 different texts. One would be our Prime Minister's Independence Day speeches, because they talk about development and how good we are and so on. So I've collected a few years of speeches and put them as one text file. And then I took a completely opposite end of spectrum where I said, how do we let's take up news about this is development. So pick the other end about buildings under construction collapsing in India. There's a lot of it. I mean, over the years. So I put all of those news articles into one piece of text. And then I've taken Patrick Schumacher's, one piece of text because it's very esoteric, very, heavy language and talks about architecture, parametricism, this, that, in a very, good way. So now you have 3 different or 4 different pieces, but you have an algorithm that doesn't care, right? It's only trying to pick words from here, join there, put together that makes no sense, but is grammatically correct. So my point is, so I see something and you get excited, then you're thinking about what can you do, and then you just bring it to your own domain. It doesn't matter what domain. It could be audio, could be video, could be like this, or form making and all sorts of this. I'll show you some more 3D examples of that. And I mix and match domains, and then I mix and match tools that work for it. So I'm not really an expert in the tools, or I would say expert as in I'm not like super expert in the tools, but I know fair bit amount and lots of tools are kind of mixed and exactly the same process. How mix domains and mix tools. And then you get this, it's mostly exploration. It takes a lot of time just trying to piece things, throw things, mix things. It's like clay modeling, right? You're like shaping it, doesn't work, you put water, you dissolve it and start sculpting something else. And at some point, the most important bit for me is all of this through code is interesting because it gives you feedback. And that's something that's phenomenally interesting about this interface for me. Because everything else, traditionally, when architecture training, you're taught to build things up, stack things, and it's like a one-time thing, you're sculpting. But in this case, I don't have to worry about the end product at all because I dump the most nonsensical things first and slowly shape it based on what it's throwing back at you. And eventually something clicks or something works out a good balance, and then you freeze on it and iterate more because now you've come to a point where you're reasonably happy with it. Very often the results are always surprising. So it's impossible. Somebody says, how do you come up with this form? No. I know I have an architectural training, but I'm not going to imagine this entire building up front or even midway. It's a process that's very important, and eventually the product does shape. So yeah, sorry, I went off on a long answer, but that's been the thing that worked for me at least, always.
Yeah, I think it's insightful. Like it's not like it evolves with experiments, and it starts with completely different intent, and then once experimentation happens, the form evolves. And it feels when you are describing mix and match, like creative coding, it's kind of a DJ, like you're trying out different algorithms. And
I've heard a lot of analogies, but not this one. It's interesting. Yeah, so for me, like a lot of people who are good with, for example, come back to pottery because it's a very tactile thing, and you get a feel for the medium, and you get a feel for how much pressure you're applying and how you apply, and so much after doing it, after going through the process for a while. And it's very personal, and it's very you can't just like how do you explain it to somebody else? It's super inherent to you. It's like shaping it, and it's all about the feel, right? In a way. Of course, I'm generalizing the whole pottery to that one thing, but anyway, you get the idea. So for me, the code is something similar in that sense. It's hard to put them two together, but for me, it's something similar because like I said in the beginning, you're not writing software, so you don't have a specific set system. So I have to do this, and I have to build things in a certain format or whatnot. It's very, for me, it feels very organic. Like I have this idea, I'm throwing things, I'm adding code up there, below here, breaking things, tweaking things. Essentially, at some point, you start getting a feel for things. You realize that, okay, if I make this parametric change, this is what it's reflecting. So some of these animations, for example, completely unscripted. Like when I started this, it's actually, I didn't even start doing this. It's actually super, you just watch for a second and I'll tell you how this is done. Let me try and play the other ones also. The 3, I think, yeah. This is done in VVV. Eventually it will bounce back and, oh, okay, sorry. It's been a while since I saw them, but the 3 of the last one, especially this, if you notice, again, because we are looking intuitively at finding patterns, and you'll start seeing that there's this whole outer thing that's kind of becoming this inner thing. Now, what happens a lot of times, and I showed this in real time. So I played it in my studio. We used to have this CC Sunday sessions used to be in a studio at one point before the pandemic. So I play this on a big screen, and people would watch, and people are always stunned. It's how do you script a movement pattern like this? Like how simple is two-dimensional on the screen, and it makes no sense because it's got looks chaotic, but it's got very structured way as to what happens inside and outside. After you watch it, then I show you that it actually rotates. It's actually in 3D, so you don't see it until I move the camera. And once I show it in 3D, suddenly it clicks. What's happening is you have a circle at a section, and that's kind of arrayed about a central point. So you have a donut, literally, right, to start with. Now think of a donut which is very small and it is scaling up. All I'm doing is instead of drawing a regular donut, all I'm doing, or torus, right? I'm only plotting the points on each section.
Mm-hmm.
So if I have whatever, let's say, resolution of so many rings in this axis and so many sections along the radial, I'm only plotting the points with the color. So when it only scaling up, so all you're looking at is because I'm seeing from a certain angle. It's three-dimensional, but you're looking at it flat from a certain angle. It kind of gives the impression that you have this circle of sorts that kind of morphing and becoming something else. It's not. It's just that the points are scaling so much that in reality the torus is intersecting itself. Like it's kind of bad geometry. If I draw the surface, it's going to look completely colliding with itself and looks really ugly. But because I'm not plotting the surface, I'm plotting the point. And this, if you see from top view versus side view versus something else, has a completely different effect. So anyway, my point is, you don't plan for this. Right? I was just trying to plot points for something else. I took a geometry as a source. I gave some color information, and I was trying to look at something else, and suddenly this happened. So then I played some more, tweaked it, got a certain set of parametric variations that I like, and then froze it. After that, it's a matter of getting the right balance because the scale factor has a. If I scale it too fast, then the central part won't be in a loop like this. I mean, you can ignore the math, but essentially, again, there's a balance, and that you find out after you hit that point.
Yeah, I think like two points which I really got from this is like it's crucial how one thinks in like section or volumes and cut down into like those section lines into points and then manipulating those shapes. And like I thought like also going sometimes outside the norm helps in this, like for example the donut shape where it's intersecting, one couldn't like, okay, it's not feasible with this shape, but when you cut it down into points, it gives another pattern. So like
Yeah.
it's, I feel like going a slider and going beyond the recommended limit in that slider sometimes gives some unique patterns.
Yeah. So, and it's just while you're doing, I mean, you're at it and you start discovering these patterns that just happen. I mean, it's hard, right? Like how do you, now that I've done it, I can probably make a tutorial about it, but how would you guess? I mean, if somebody said that, I had this exact idea and I'm trying to do this, it's hard because I don't believe it unless they've been working with three-dimensional geometry and wireframes. You won't have discovered. And sure, if you're doing wireframe work and you're doing all that kind of work, then at some point you realize that this breaks in reality, but it has very beautiful visual effect. So this particular piece that this is the only one, I mean, among the ones I've shown you so far, where I started with an idea that I really want to execute. And I've used the tool to its max, I mean, not maximum, but whatever I could to kind of generate this. So I was at one point thinking about clocks. And no, actually, how this happened. Reddit has this, if you're familiar, there's one sub for bad UI. They intentionally try and break the UI and do some really funky things with some extremely terrible UI. And very fun. So one of those days, somebody had posted this bad UI for a clock, where I forget what the exact original idea was. And then I looked at it and I said, oh, okay, how about I make a clock where the dial doesn't turn, but the hands, the dials turn, but the hands are static. Like that. The entire clock faces turn. So I was a quick sketch and I knew what I wanted to do. But what was important and took me time to make was that I wanted to make it in a format where if I explain to you the logic, you should be able to read time of it. And it is possible in this case because this is a seconds and hour, minutes and hour. So this is going in anti-clockwise. So obviously this is 0, the 5, 10, 15, and the somewhere in 20 seconds. Same thing, you go the other way around. This is 12 o'clock. So 11, 10, 9, 8, 7, 6 or whatever, sorry, right? And then that way. So also this is the minutes hand, and then you climb the clock, hour hand is there. So you take this vertical line of intersection and then you count backwards and then you have the time. So it's kind of completely nonsensical in the sense that it's inverted logic. And then I started making a series. I haven't posted the rest, but I was trying to work on a series of abstract clocks. So where each of them was super abstract, they're very difficult in first glance, but once you look at it and if it tells you the logic, you will be able to read time of it. And this one idea where it's start from with a strong idea and then build it up.
I have a question, like how do you balance between abstractness and specificness? Like for example, in that clock, many people would have got like the logic in first glance. Some people took time, some people might take faster if there are like numbers around it. Like how do you allow more room for interpretation, or like?
So that's a hard challenge actually. It's very easy to make things abstract, and it's obviously very easy to make things fairly easy to make things straightforward depending on your domain. It's this in between where you want to retain this abstractness yet make it controlled, right, and like kind of readable in whatever format. It's a very difficult task. A lot of data driven art that you see looks extremely beautiful, and that's one of my main problems. Even the work we do, we also do a lot of data driven art. It's something that's there at the back of my mind in every piece we do, and we've not been 100% successful. So it's super easy to make. I can take all the data you give me and make a very beautiful abstraction. But if the moment you say I want to be able to read it and not make it look like a data visualization, that's really difficult. And you see very few examples of some that balance happening. And that's across all the domains. If you want to make a super abstract thing, in fact, abstraction is very, very easy to make. You don't even need to know much, right? And then the problem there is, if I take all the data or whatever you give me and I make a beautiful abstraction, and if you can't read it, then you might actually say you could have thrown some random numbers and made this abstraction, which is true, right? Because I've taken your numbers. Let's say you've given me your sleep data. In fact, I have it here. This is from my Fitbit tracking data. It's quite abstract at this point. If I told you, obviously I try to control how to read this and all, but it's still fairly abstract. And if let's say I don't tell you what this is, I'm showing it to you and saying, look, I've taken your sleep data. It kind of takes your the hours you've slept and the 4 cycles, right? The REM and whether you're deep sleep or you've been up in night and all of that. Your tracker does I'm not saying accurate job, but it's enough for an art piece. If I showed you this and said, this is your sleep data, and if you said, look, I can do the same thing, you just give me some Berlin noise and I'll make this fancy graphic. Sure, you can. I mean, absolutely. I know. In fact, that looks like Berlin noise. So it's a hard challenge, But so attaching meaning, and that's something we try and do. So if I sat you down and said, look, this is your data and this is how you read it, and if you see that there is that bit of reflection, maybe the pace at which this changes, or maybe the color change, or maybe the stripes versus the formation or whatever, and if you're able to relate it to whatever data or I tell you, you've given me, there's so much more value because suddenly it's both abstract and personal, and more importantly, it's something that it's not random. So I'm sorry I didn't answer your question about how, because it's very like I said, it's a very fine balance between how much of an abstraction and how much is readable. But I think it's important to have it, because otherwise it's just glorified animation. Otherwise, why even go for the trouble of trying to code something and make it real time? It's just a nice animation, and people are getting far better animations at this.
I see. So it's a challenge of like giving meaning to those randomness and like giving that experience to end user, where like it's just not like some beautiful pixels, but it carries like some value.
Maybe one example for that will be where I've tried to these. So I've tried to take the air pollution data in the city. This is, I think, what is this? Mumbai. Okay. Actually, I'll show you all three first. That's Mumbai, this is Delhi, and this is Bangalore. Obviously, I've handpicked locations. Air pollution is not uniform across city, and I know that relatively Delhi is worse in pollution levels than Bangalore, for example. So I handpicked that particular location in Delhi, which is really bad, and the better one in Bangalore. If I take the worst one in Bangalore and the best one in Delhi, then it will be the opposite way. so big disclaimer: this is not a citywide indication. It's just handpicked to go with popular trends. But anyway, so Delhi. So I've taken there is the information is available online. There are lots of weather stations and there's publicly available data. I forget where the source is. I haven't written down somewhere. I've taken the data, and now if I showed you like the first instance, I showed you these three together, and I ask you which is worse. You have no idea what this is, but you will say, yeah, this one is worse. You know, whatever this is the worst, and this is semi okay, and this is better. You know, because it's a choice of colors and it's got a black center, and if I tell you it's pollution, you already associate it with it, right? So there is that level of belief that this makes some sense. But just to show that I actually mean business and it's not just random, this is how it's actually plotted. There's a monthly this thing, and you can see if I tell you now that look, I'm not plotting this thing. I don't want it to be a typical data whiz. But if I tell you that, imagine the vertical axis start with January, go clockwise all the way to December, and tell me which month is worse. And see, you're not bothered about the specificities, but you're bothered about the overall impact. And you say, oh, wow, okay, somewhere in the winter, it looks like it's getting really bad. And, that's value. And you can see that, yeah. And same thing with that's Mumbai and Bangalore. So right, like in Mumbai, for that particular location, beyond from March to about October, it looks like it's having fairly decent. It's just somewhere in the winter months, right? November to Feb, and it's not as bad as Delhi. But and this is a PM, the AQI, the PM 2.5 is what the value of taken. So it's all data. But really, I don't want you to focus on. As long as I tell you that all the scales are the same, otherwise it makes no sense. And black is worst and green is good. And this has got a radial structure for monthly distribution, then it's enough. So you're able to make sense. And on its own, it looks like a piece of art. I mean, to me, it does. Maybe it's abstract enough, but it's got the meaning to it. Again, I'm not saying this is a good example, but this is the step in the direction where I'm trying to explore as to how do you get that.
Yeah, and
yeah, one thing I want to add is this something I do with law, and there's some strong proponent of this, that you make things super abstract. On its own, it won't make sense, but you repeat that for more cases and put them as a comparative thing, then it starts making more sense. And for years, I've been talking about this, saying, do a comparative thing all the time, because then you tend to learn faster. It's not abstract anymore. On its own, it might not mean anything. Even if I showed you Bangalore first, and if I showed you this, saying, okay, look, this is what it is. Yeah, okay, cool. It's fairly for that location, very less pollution, but it's boring. But the moment you put three, and I actually want to put some cities outside India, but then the scales are so off. Unfortunately for us, they're almost flat. Like I can take the worst polluted one in some other better country. I don't know, better in sense, better for air quality, and then we are off the scales. Like in that entire country, every city will look the same because we've calibrated a scale for Delhi, which is on the other end of the spectrum. So it's data science, data visualization, and data-driven art. But somewhere is a balance, and you can't shirk away from it. Sorry, yeah. You think?
I think you read my mind. I was just about to share that, like, and the artwork, the single image in itself, has meaning. But when you compare, like, one can say, okay, Delhi is better than Mumbai. Okay, everyone knows. But when one show, okay, it's like 60%, or like in the visually, it's quite provocative, and that's the beauty of like this kind of powerful artwork, that it provocates that.
Sorry, while we're talking, I'll just pull up one more at an urban design level. The document I shared with you has that. I'll try and quickly pull it up. Yeah. Okay, I'll you have it open in front of you by any chance?
Let me check my screen.
So there, in urban scale, we've done the study in the Middle East. So we were comparing 8 countries and 10 cities for pre-oil architecture and urbanism. So that before the Middle East struck oil, when they were more sustainably living, because resources are few and harsh climatic conditions and whole civilization thrive. So we're trying to study that kind of a system. So one of the studies that we did, and I put up this for each city. We're taking the street network, old cities. They look like almost like our old cities in like old Delhi or old Hyderabad. Like in those pockets of old cities which have this very organic, very beautiful, intricate patterns. So we mapped out for all the cities, and I tried to map what you call as a privacy levels of these networks. So now there's a method to quantify it, about how you can color code the entire road network as to what part of it is more public and what part is less, in a manner of speaking, qualitatively. And there are mathematical way to calculate some metric. But the metric and the drawing doesn't make any sense if you don't put together the other densities at the same scale. Because suddenly you'll say, oh wow, okay, old Doha versus old Kuwait is a huge difference. That triggers a impression, because you say, they didn't have architects and urban designers to lay down rules. So organically growing cities have this intrinsic character that some have this very private character and some have this very public character, or so on. And there's many, many metrics like that. So it's comparative things, kind of, you don't need to have the metric on its own, doesn't need to make sense. But if you have the same scale and the same comparative thing and there's a meaning to it, then you start associating, there's a lot of value. And we try and do it for our artwork, where we are always sampling data. So we want to reflect the data back, but because it's artistic and it's not a data visualization, you're not really concerned about, like, ideally these air pollution things, if you ask me, some purists would come and say, you've got to make a bar chart. I mean, that's like, what nonsense. Like, why do you even have this thing and this very organic, funky colors? You just give me black and white bar chart monthly saying my PM 2.5 is this. In one shot, I know which month is good and which month is bad, right? I mean, right. Like, I would never recommend doing this for a database. It makes no sense. But then that is that. So if I want to make a project out of this, where I'm trying to subliminally teach people that, look, like, when I put this up, and I have a few more, when I put this up, people instantly hits you. You don't know what the PM 2.5 means. You don't know what the technical terms mean. You don't know anything, but just know that, holy crap, my city is so much worse than this city. And that's the power of art, I guess. There's one more like this. I've taken air wind speeds. Again, a comparative metric, so it kind of works well. I can't find. Okay, never mind.
I have your portfolio if you want me to share screen, but I think you covered the point. So it's
I think it's also there.
Yeah.
Are we out of time? We talk too much.
Yeah. Maybe we can cover one or two more and then do a wrap up. So I think one important point which was you highlighted, that comparison and provoking people who are not that much knowledgeable, but also, like, as artists, it's important that there's no miscommunication in that information. So if the same data you compared for three cities, if it was not calibrated, one could have a totally different interpretation of it and some like information out of the artwork.
And then a lot of other things come into play. Same in your ML world also, right? Question of ethics and moralities, because I could easily be technically correct in representing data, but crafting a different effect altogether by my choice of colors and my choice of encoding. So that's why data visualization is very critical, and you don't want to do these kind of abstractions for that, because a bar chart with a certain this thing, as long as you're not violating the simple bar chart rules, you don't have any wrong impression of things. So I don't like data-driven art for us is to get this less of a prescriptive thing that you got to change your lifestyle or change this or that. I mean, obviously you want to make these big statements about how things are, but more about trying to personalize the data for you. People are not interested in like data affects all of us, but only a few of us are actually inclined to be able to read, understand, and probably reflect. And for me, data-driven art is one method where the data which is personal to you becomes personalized in this abstraction. So as long as you are not being unethical or just being ignorant or stupid, you don't do a bad job of conveying the information. So don't make it too abstract. I mean, we're trying to. We're not successful at it fully, but we're trying to get that balance for most data sets that we work with. And it's hard. We don't have a solution. It depends entirely on the domain, about what you're trying to do, and so many other factors.
Yeah. So I think to keep best interest of time, we'll discuss one artwork, and I have like I'll summarize what we discuss. So we discuss a lot of toolkits starting for V4 processing, P5, and like a lot of algorithms, including attractor, Perlin, how Perlin noise can be used in different ways to make different artwork. And so I wanted to touch base upon like for getting started, like for me it helped taking more inspiration from like gaming and mathematics world, where procedural content generation, like you mentioned about L system, which is kind of a shape grammar algorithm.
Right.
And
Yeah.
the gaming industry like because of the need of generating so many virtual worlds, they need to be effective, and they have figured out a lot of algorithms to convert those algorithms into a 3D world or 2D artwork, even for terrain, buildings. So to get started, maybe considering those case studies would help to get ideas. And I would like to know like what are like this might be very generic and question, like for creative coders, like what do you recommend to for toolkits and framework to get started? And
Oh, yeah. So no, it's not generic. It's toolkits. The one tried, tested, and that works and is heavily recommended for anybody beginning is to use processing for two reasons. One, that was designed precisely for this purpose. When Ben and Casey, who started this as part of their MIT Media Labs program, they've done a toolkit to help artists and non-programmers get into programming. And processing has what now, I don't know, 18 years, 19 years. I think because one or two, probably 20 years of background. It's a huge community, easy to learn. Most importantly, it has some of the best resources for learning, especially this whole series by someone called Dan Schiffman. That one resource start with, and they've evolved over the years. They started with a Java-based tool, and they've introduced Python to it. And today, you have a JavaScript, which makes it even more accessible because it's on the browser. And and Dan Schiffman has covered so many concepts. Almost everything that I've learned over the years has been through his resource at some point or the other, and then eventually started learning on my own or evolved or whatever. And I still go back to his stuff. It's and the good thing about processing is it's not just for beginners. Like it's professional toolkit. You can do everything with it. There's nothing that it's not good at or it's so that's the easiest answer actually. There are many more, but really processing and shipment stuff can get you into creative coding in a big way. And then eventually you'll figure out if you're going to go a little more deeper and professional or non-professional but deeper, and then you have a specific area of interest, like you're going into real-time toolkits, then you would start moving away from processing. There's so many. The real-time again has desktop-based versus web-based. Desktop-based you have V4 and Touch Designer. Web-based is Cables and Notes.io, which is very recent, and there are many more. If you go into audio, then you have Max MSP and Pure Data, and then there's a few more newer toolkits I can't remember now for audio. Then there's some specific ones for video. Then so each of them, and then some general purpose ones like V4 can handle a bunch of things. So it's really a matter of there are a lot of toolkits available today and very powerful that leverage all your modern GPU and all those things. And very mature products also. Cables is fantastic, absolutely fantastic and web based. So you don't have to learn shaders. It's kind of built in. You can get all the shaders power and performance without knowing too much about it. So stuff like that. You can branch, and there's many good tools. The good thing is most of them are open source, and that's not all of them, but a lot of good open source tools in creative coding, and they're very mature and very good. So there's no dearth of tools, but starting maybe I would say stick to processing. Maybe P5JS because that's the new thing, and it's very new as in it's JavaScript and the latest among the processing tools. Big community. That'll be a good place to start.
yeah, like the reason I ask is like many times, like especially for younger generation and in my like people see a lot of Instagram artwork and they ask which software do you use and like how to make such good artwork, and rather than sticking to a base software and learning it deeply in algorithmic way and process of thinking, they start jumping on different software. So like that is a challenge I foresee. So
Yeah, so I think processing would be a good fit. It's probably the best one to start with, but then very quickly you can branch out into all sorts of. Oh, I've seen some questions here and I forgot. Enros are not. Sorry, yeah. Sorry, yeah. Sorry, my you were saying.
oh I think maybe if you can so we saw a lot of artwork and we got to know about your process, and uh, I wanted to know more about like how do you deal with a problem where you want to make a data driven art but you don't have like data source itself.
Don't have a data source. How do you do it then? No data. No data. And data sourcing data itself is an art. So luckily, what's happened is I think these days a lot of open data sets and lots of good all the governments, like even the Indian government has this open data they try and combine. Now the data itself might not be in the format that we need, or might not be the raw data might not be useful in its own format and so on. So they will always, in our experience, and we work with all sorts of data sets, finding data hasn't been difficult. But there's definitely a big process involved that once you find the data, you've got to process it, post process it, and convert it to a format uh, which can then be plugged into your interface. So that takes a bit of it's a technical know-how, but definitely a little bit of changing things. Or so again, you would only hit really technical issues when the data sets are massive or you're trying to deal with some lots of but otherwise, I don't think for the purposes of yeah.
I have a question from Sujay, and is what's your take on latest craze in NFT and blockchain in artwork? How do you think it will impact the digital art scene?
Honestly, it's it's one of those things where it's super hard to predict. There's been a lot of well, on the downside, there's been a lot of research and studies showing how it's badly impacting environment and so on. That's a huge concern. If you put that apart for a second, purely to analyze the other impact, because there are NFTs and blockchains coming up which kind of are trying to address the ecological problems. Now, for digital art scene, I think, like I say, it's early days for me, but I am generally optimistic. I'm bullish about how this might work. Because traditionally, what happened is while like selling digital art and giving ownership is a huge problem, and that fundamentally has been a bottleneck for most digital art. A lot of us have been making art, and there are many people before me who have been making for decades. But then, how do you attach value to it? Because typically, art like you own it, and there's sense of ownership, and then nobody else has a copy. By digital, by its nature, is impossible to assure that, right? It's like so. I think with the blockchain. Um, at least one thing that they're trying to address and is this the idea of ownership. So then it's got intrinsic value because at least somebody can claim that this is belongs to one. And if there's going to be copies, then you know how many copies are floating around, and there's still a limit to it. So it's slowly like again, I'm coming from an artistic perspective. We are seeing people asking us if we have it minted somewhere because then they want to acquire something and they know that they own it versus me making a million copies and selling it. People don't want it. Let's put it that way. India is still a little quite nascent. Again, we have a whole bit of confusion about the cryptocurrency and what's the government stance and all that. And But otherwise, we are seeing a lot of traction, and a lot of art collectors have been asking us if we have start putting it up on blockchains. In fact, we've started very recently. We didn't mint until sometime back. We just started doing. Now we have made a few pieces, and we're still exploring the ecosystem to see which is a better interface to mint it. But we have to start doing it because art collectors have started asking us, and that never happened. We would be going around to people saying, "Look, we've made this. You want it, or can we get this be real time? This can be interactive, and so on." But now slowly the people who are in the art world who want to know are asking us, asking at least are saying, okay, you have to make it. It's not a validation of anything, just that I feel like at least one issue which is ownership is being addressed, and I'm generally excited about the technology and its potential. We'll have to see if there's a lot of craze now. We'll have to see how long it lasts or it's going to get bigger. I don't know.
And what's coming next for you?
What's coming next? So, that's hard because I do a bunch of different things at the same time. So in terms of the artwork specifically, at Codebale, we've been trying to do multiple things. So this is real-time digital art. Then we've done some demos for augmented reality stuff for the museum in Bangalore, MoMA. Sorry, not MoMA, National Gallery in Bangalore, AGMA. So we're trying to explore multiple formats. They're all digital, so they can be physical also, but then essentially it's code-driven, data-driven, and ideally real-time and interactive. But then if some outlets don't need it, then it's a static impression, but again personalized towards the data. So slowly we are starting to get into trying to see how you can use data to kind of make artifacts like jewelry or furniture. Kind of like a niche products, not so much like furniture. You don't take a chair and say, look, this chair has been done based on your data and it looks as funky. It's more of an art piece than a functional or a balance. So we're trying to we've moved, like we're also doing physical developments which started, and with the pandemic we've not done. We're going to get 3D printing. We've been exploring. We're tying up with people to kind of print our pieces, like the attractor points, have done 3D versions, how we want to print them. Or piece of audio, and we're trying to see how we can make an audio visualization that's not a static, that's a digital one, but make it a physical impression so that you have this piece of sculpture where again I tell you how this has been generated with a piece of music you have, and then this is a representation of that. So stuff like that. So we're getting to more physical interfaces slowly, but retaining that logic of data-driven work. What else? We've been approached by, we've been trying to develop some music, like for concerts, pieces that go in real time with the performer, so that there's this whole, it's not a new concept, it's been there, but we have our own twist to it, again, based on the new tools and data, or something that's personal to the music and so on. Stuff like that. So yeah, it's a bunch of different things we're hoping to see what goes well. Homes, in the personal homes and all, we're trying to put up some different kind, like the sleep data I said. So we're trying to get data which is personal to the clients. It could be a financial or stock data or whatever, as long anonymized. But and then we're trying to put that up as your own in your home as a backdrop somewhere where it constantly keeps changing. If you want it to be readable, it is readable. If you want it to be abstract, it is abstract. So on. Stuff.
I see. And I think this has been very insightful discussion, and I wish it goes on and on. So my last concluding question is there anything we didn't get a chance to discuss and you would like to share thoughts or?
No, I think nothing specific, because there is some other work in 3D and in other kinds of, but the intrinsic process is the same no matter what work I've done. Whether it is the portraits, which is very simplistic ones, to more complex ones. Almost all of them data-driven, code-driven, and they start with no specific end product in mind. Also, inspiration, like we discussed, comes from whatever domain, and it's mostly been explorated. So I think that's the same thing everywhere. It's just manifested in different ways, whether it is the video work or the three-dimensional, it's the same process. So I think we've covered. I don't have anything to add.
Awesome. So I really want to thank Karthik. I know you have been quite busy and occupied with a lot of work you have been involved, and it has been a great session to know a lot of your artwork and the process. And I personally was quite inspired and triggered to do more exploration now.
Thanks a lot. This was good fun.
All right. Have a good night and take care. Bye bye.
Bye.